Welcome to the Code and Bootstrapping Podcast. Derrick Reimer, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here. You've done a lot of coding and bootstrapping. You had a part in Codetree, which I'm not too familiar with, HitTail, Drip, Level, now StaticKit. 3 out of 5 built into successful businesses and sold. It's not bad.
Yeah, it's been a pretty interesting ride the last decade, I suppose. Yeah.
Sure. I want to ask a little bit about all of them, but first, season's greetings. I'm feeling a little bit like you were talking about in your Art of Product podcast, number 11, where your partner, or sorry, number 18, the prepping for Black Friday. Your partner Ben was selling like a Rails training course, and
Oh man, that's a throwback.
I've never done a Black Friday promotion before, but I've been buying a ton this year. Like I got some books on Manning. I got like a kind of a site that works like mine does, but it teaches Rails. I got Lyricast subscriptions. Just kind of been going down the list.
It's crazy how early Black Friday starts now. Like we're talking on Tuesday of Black Friday week or Thanksgiving week. Thanksgiving's the real holiday that's happening. But like it's I feel like I've been getting emails for the last week already, and it's like, come on, guys. It's a little early. Well, it's a race to who can start first, I suppose.
Being out in Taiwan, like I am right now, Thanksgiving kind of disappeared, but now I'm like more aware of it again because of Black Friday.
Yeah.
Just crazy. Yeah. So your startups, did you do anything before Codetree?
So Codetree actually started while I was working on Drip. So just to give like a quick kind of how I got into the industry. Let's see, I went to college to be a math major, so I wasn't planning at the time to be a professional software developer. And that was, I'd say I graduated back in 2009. So about 10 years ago. And at the time I was like, I don't know, maybe I'll be an actuary, go like sit and compute insurance rates for insurance companies or something.
I thought about the same. I was a math major as well.
Really?
Until 3 years in, and then I switched to Japanese.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think I just kind of did it because it's like, well, I like math, and I don't know, like many people entering college, I was just like, I'm not really sure what I want to do. So I'm just going to thankfully I had a scholarship, so I wasn't like going deep into debt to get this degree that I didn't end up using. But
it's a lot of optionality.
Yeah. And so coming out, I was like, it was around that time I discovered 37 Signals, and I was kind of like, I immediately latched on to kind of their way of looking at business. I was also like a business minor, so that kind of signals that I was already thinking about like wanting to do my own thing for a while, but just hadn't really put the pieces together of what it was going to look like. And so when I discovered, Jason Fried, I listened to every single talk he gave that was on the internet at the time, and just kind of lapped it up and was like, wow, this is like the kind of founder that I want to be, like run these companies that aren't kind of, on the venture capital track, but like just building small businesses that happen to run on the internet and have extremely high profit margins,
Sounds good. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that was 2009, 2010. And then, so I took a leap and joined this like local, startup competition called 59 Days of Code that was started by kind of a local software engineer who was trying to develop the community and draw people out of the woodwork who were doing software but weren't really like in community with each other.
Was that Rob Welling?
No. So Rob was actually involved he was a judge in this competition, and that's how we met.
Okay.
Yeah. He had just moved to the area. And this was in Fresno, California. And so it's right in the Central Valley. So he had just moved there, and he was trying to get involved with kind of the local startup and software community, and was invited to be a judge in this. And so I ended up doing that competition for a couple of years actually, and had like saved up enough money right after college and through the tail end of college that I kind of decided to go try to make a run at it and do my own thing, 37 Signals style. And kind of started to develop just a friendship with Rob and kind of a mentorship relationship. There was kind of a group of 3 of us that met up every couple of weeks for a couple of years. And nothing really successful came out of that time period, but I learned a ton in trying various startups
Mm-hmm.
and failing at them for different reasons. And I basically got to the point where I was gonna start doing consulting work. Like I was going to, set aside my ambitions of going, all in on building my own startups, and I was going to start doing some consulting just to bring in revenue and continue working on the side. And it was around that time that Rob was like, "Hey, why don't I have HitTail, this
SEO.
app that I bought?" Yeah, and he had purchased it. I want to say it was like 6 months before or something, and like things were going good. Like he was turning it around. But he was kind of thinking about like what's the next thing he wants to work on, but HitTail still needs someone to kind of run it. So he kind of, I
Gotcha.
joined initially with Rob as a contractor part time to just help do like product management and marketing for HitTail.
Oh, you weren't programming on it.
No, I mean originally the plan was for me not to.
Interesting.
Like
Okay.
he had some, it was written in classic ASP, which is like this old Microsoft language.
But
And
that was big then. That was like mid 2000s or something.
I mean, I would say by the time he took over, it was pretty
So
much a dead language.
okay.
Yeah, I mean, this is like a VB6 on the internet is kind of what this is. So like a mid 90s language put on the internet. So anyways, just so happens I learned how to program when I was a kid on Visual Basic. And so I actually kind of could hack on HitTail. And so it wasn't long before I just kind of started building stuff on there as part of my my job. And he was like, "Oh, it didn't even dawn on me that like you might know how to code ASP and build stuff on this." So that was kind of fun. Like I kind of like started the process of wearing many hats, like all of us do as founders,
I mean, that's great. Like I started
Yeah.
off as a non-technical founder, and the second business I did, like I was just wishing I had those superpowers because there's so much. It's like
Yeah.
this really long lever you can use to get all kinds of things done without spending a lot of time on it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, so that's a cool story, and I think a lot of people have probably heard him talk about HitTail and talk about
Mm-hmm.
Drip, um,
Mm-hmm.
and you had it on your podcast as well. I didn't know that HitTail was classic ASP, but
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's um, yeah. So that's pretty interesting. You had, I think, episode 71. You talked about a bunch of there was something about the pricing with Drip changing, and there was a thread about that, and you were talking about like the never again list. Like
Yeah.
with HitTail, you never again wanted to rely on Google. With
Yeah.
Drip, you never again wanted to rely on sending out email because Drip is a big email service provider.
Yeah.
And was there a never again with Codetree?
Um, so I don't think it was I didn't feel super burned by
No,
anything
nothing, no scars there.
in particular, but I think the biggest thing that the Codetree experience made me cautious about was just building your business on top of heavily reliant upon another. So Codetree was a issue tracking system, lightweight project management built on top of GitHub issues, basically. So
Yeah.
so it allows people who are using GitHub issues already to basically view them in a little bit different way, kind of in a Trello style board view, or kind of give you the ability to order your issues, things that GitHub issues just doesn't have built in. And that model of building a business directly on top of someone else has like pros and cons that balance each other out, right? So the pros are you get to leverage someone else's audience. So I kind of kicked off the business generating like interest in it by running Twitter ads. And I don't know if this would still work today because
What
this
year was
was
it?
years ago. 2014, I think.
Oh, okay,
Um,
so that's a few years after the whole Twitter. There's another podcaster we both follow, Justin Vincent from TechZing.
mhm.
and
Mm-hmm.
he did a program called Plugio, and he was
Yeah.
complaining in one episode. I think it was like 112 or 118 or something,
Mm-hmm.
where he was saying like Twitter had just shut down a key feature that they were using, and then like he
Yeah.
talked to them, and then maybe he could do it, but it wasn't clear that it was truly allowed, and it could be shut down at any point later. So
Yeah,
yeah,
I've
I
had
would be.
my fun with building an app on top of Twitter too that uh that didn't work out. But like, yeah, I mean, you so I ran some Twitter ads targeting people who follow the GitHub account, which is close to 1 million people at the time, and instantly I could like get my message in front of people who would probably be interested in something like Codetree because they're already, have shown that they're interested in GitHub or using GitHub or whatever because they're following them on Twitter. And so you can kind of draft off of momentum that another platform has by building on top of them. Same with something like WordPress plugins, where you get to put something in the WordPress repository, and you're basically, you kind of have a free marketing channel there. Just by
Yeah,
nature of being in that ecosystem, right? So
right.
there's a bunch of positives to it, but then the negatives are, of course, like similar to what Twitter did to Plugio or to other people. Like they kind of control what you're allowed to do on their system, and eventually, if you provide enough value, they may decide to build that into their platform. So you always have to be kind of on guard. Like, am I staying differentiated enough from what the core product is offering, and if they're moving into eroding the value that I'm providing, then how can I continue to adapt and make sure I stay relevant, building on top of their platform.
Now, would you? I guess you did put those on your never again list, but what do you think about somebody doing something built on another platform, especially if it's emerging? If it's just
Hmm.
if like they're not trying to build a long term business, but it's like they just want to get some experience, some early success,
Yeah.
because
No, I think
that's
it's a
kind of where I
really
would look at it.
yeah, no, I think it's a really good place to start. So my um, co-founder at Drip, Rob Walling, we've brought him up already. Like he has this kind of concept called the stair step approach, and it's on his blog. You could probably link it up in
I'll
the
yeah,
in the
I'll
show
definitely
notes.
like that. That influenced me.
Um,
That was
yeah,
useful.
yeah, and so he kind of talks about like if you're just new into the bootstrapping space, like don't start with some standalone SaaS thing. Like that's the hardest road. And it's good from a learning perspective and from a quick wins perspective and the mental side of it, everything, to just kind of start with something where you can start making your first dollars on the internet, if you haven't done it before, and then kind of gradually level up your skills. So start with something like a WordPress plugin or a small utility built on top of another platform, like something where there's more built-in momentum to draft off of, and kind of develop your chops and kind of gradually level up, I think is a really good approach.
Have you? Sorry, I'll get back to the others like level and then StaticKit in a second.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
have you done any like pure info products like ebooks or tutorials, courses?
Yeah, I've flirted with it at times over the years, but I haven't actually done those. No. It's something that a lot of people do as another way to kind of bring in money into their business while they're also working on SaaS or something that just takes a lot longer.
And I've
So that's
seen
also a good.
it. I've seen it work of the few people that I've followed. Like one of the first like entrepreneurial info products I ever bought was a program called Creating Fame from Laura Roeder, and
Mm-hmm.
she was basically selling like very like beginner level Twitter training in courses,
Mm-hmm.
and she only had like 5 or 6 courses total, and doing like 7 figures a year for a long time. Built a gigantic audience, and
Yeah.
now is running a social media management tool called Meet Edgar.
Yep.
And
Yep.
like that audience was like obvious from the beginning. It's like, oh, she has who knows how many people following her for social media management and strategy advice. And now here's a tool made for those people.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
and
it can be a
yeah,
really interesting way to, especially if you're methodical about like thinking about the audience you're building your info products for, and then if you have some kind of eventual goal to sell that audience software, then being deliberate about trying to kind of build on top of the same the same kind of audience and following that you're building from the info products, I think is a really smart approach to take. I've seen others do it less directly, and it's like it can be hard to build a business on top of an audience. I think it only gets you so far. Even with Drip, Rob is pretty open about talking about this. Like a lot of the early traction that Drip had was because he had built up this following as an authority, a voice in the entrepreneurship space, and people doing marketing and needing email marketing tools, And so we got to a pretty good amount of revenue just kind of based off of selling to the audience he had built up through the podcast and through his book and all the things. And but that only gets you so far. And then eventually you have to break outside of the people who already know you and follow you and really start, working the process of executing marketing strategies and stuff. But it can be a really good way to get early exposure.
Yeah, and it's gotta work. Like it's gotta be delivering the email and all of that kind of thing.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's actually a topic I've thought about quite a bit with like the initial audience and what kinds of things will help you with a lot, what kinds of things it won't. I think obviously it'll give you a big chance at least getting heard and getting a chance to get traction if what you built is good.
Yeah.
What do you think about how much of a niche to go after? Like one thing I've noticed is I chose a pretty extreme niche. Like I chose Elixir, and it wasn't purely because I thought this is where I will make the most money. It was partially because I think Elixir's got a lot of properties that are nice for building a web startup, and because it was something that would be fairly easy for me since I already knew it fairly well when I started. But I've seen a lot of other people kind of like come out of nowhere, or at least it looks that way to me, just targeting like all of JavaScript or all of PHP or social media in general. And even if they get a small slice of it, it may be more than like everybody who's learning the 50th most popular programming language.
Yeah. It's hard to know for sure. I mean, I think there's value in being kind of one of the earlier voices building up authority in a particular technology that you feel like will eventually grow in prominence, and so I think I've thought about this from time to time as I've flirted with like doing info products or something where like I wrote a lot of Elm for a year when I was building Level, for example, and like
I wanted to ask about that.
Yeah, like Elm is a very nascent in the grand scheme of things, and like it appeals to a particular group really heavily, and then a lot of other people just hate it, like can't stand the way it works, and that can be a good thing because you can people have strong opinions about it, and those who really love it, and so becoming like a voice, for example, in the Elm community can be can really establish your authority in a way that would be much harder to do if you were just going to try to become yet another React.js expert. Like there's so many of those.
And I think
so. It's like
sorry, I just quickly throw that out for anyone listening is like interested in hearing more about what you did with Elm. Check out episode 49 of the Art of Product podcast. It's called The Evolving Tech Stack. And you talked about using Elm and Elixir. Yeah. And Elm is basically like a strict, functional, statically typed programming language that outputs JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. And like its big selling point is like if this thing compiles, you won't get any runtime bugs unless it's from like JavaScript ports that you've connected to your Elm code.
Yep.
Did you need an extreme level of security of stability or guarantee building Level, which was basically like an alternative to Slack that emphasized deep work and was less interruptive? Like, was there?
I think that what appealed to me about Elm was that it was less about like I wanted to make sure I never threw a runtime error in production. Like that was a side benefit, like I didn't feel like this was so this wasn't like NASA grade software or something that I needed to build, right? But like I liked the idea that, I was looking for a technology stack that a solo founder could really make the most out of, and I felt like Elm gave me a lot of structure. So it kind of sets one path for building a front end.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's a pretty simplistic model at the core, which has good properties and bad properties, right? Like the good thing is like it's very predictable in how it runs. Every page basically has a model and a view and an update function, and you can split that up into different functions as you want to, but ultimately that's like the paradigm's pretty simple, and that is in stark contrast to the other popular frameworks like React and you know
Although
Angular and all these other things,
I think
right?
React, Redux, especially like the way people were using React with Redux, I thought that was
Right.
largely inspired by the Elm architecture.
Yeah, for sure it is. And now there's a perfect example. You look and Redux has fallen out of favor. Like people don't use Redux anymore. And like, there's just so much, like, I don't know, I can rant for a long time about the churn in the technology churn in the JavaScript ecosystem. And so this was partially like, I was looking for an environment where there's not going to be all this, thrashing and all this constant churn of like every week there's a new way to do data management on the front end, and
Yeah.
and because I wanted to build this for the long haul, and I wanted this to be a very stable code base where I didn't feel like every 6 months to a year I was going to have to rip out a large chunk of the way it works and rewrite it in the latest flavor of the week, in order to stay current with current technology trends.
Do you think it'll have like a bit more chance at lasting in its open source incarnation because of that?
So Level, I mean, is not an active open source project right now. And so, I mean, to kind of give listeners the end,
Yeah,
end of that story, like
in there.
yeah, like I ultimately ended up deciding not to go forward any further with Level because despite all my validation efforts, and I've talked about this a lot on podcasts, but like despite all my validation efforts, very few people were actually willing to adopt it as an alternative to Slack, because Slack has its tentacles deeply deeply ingrained into the modern organizations, and like I think the tides will turn eventually. Is still my hypothesis that Slack is not a healthy default way to communicate, and encourages all kinds of bad habits. But I mean, I think it's for better or worse, it's so deeply embedded in the way that companies work today. And as a bootstrapper, I just determined that like I don't have infinite runway. I don't have years to wait for the industry to catch up on like deciding like, oh, there's actually a better way to do this.
It's a huge task. Although I have to say, I wish I had encountered your podcast sooner and started hearing about it, because what you were saying about it like really resonated with me. Like I also read Cal Newport's Deep Work book.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed it, like so much that I bought his course that he did with Scott Young afterward. Like a lot of the focus of this whole thing is like teaching you how to not be distracted and just really focus intensely for longer periods of time and really get hard things done. I think the vision was amazing, but I also can see how that's not what most people, it's not the direction a lot of people are moving in right now. Or maybe they are, but only a small number. So it was a good story. Definitely check that out on your podcast. So now you're working on another thing already called StaticKit, which is for static sites. And this is going to sound like a really simple or pedantic question, but what exactly is a static site now?
Sure. Yeah. So I think probably a lot of people are familiar with kind of GitHub's, GitHub pages and kind of Jekyll, the thing that allowed you to kind of the quirky way of building a website where you could put a bunch of files in a thing and run a Jekyll build command and it would spit out a built site for you. So you could do things like put your header in a separate file and then drop that as an include in your pages, and like the build step would compile it all together into like a set of flat files that then you could throw up on GitHub Pages or throw them on a CDN or S3 or wherever you want to host, right? And I think they were one of the early pioneers of kind of giving people a viable way to just write HTML and just write Markdown and things like that.
But also JavaScript, right?
Yeah, and also JavaScript. Yep. I would say Jekyll is less JavaScript centric than a lot of the newer flavors of generators, but for sure you can include your JavaScript files.
You can get what was traditionally considered dynamic functionality, but you're not getting it from the server. You're not getting it from your own server.
Right. Or what was previously handled by kind of a monolithic stack like WordPress. Like an alternative to something like Jekyll would be, spin up a WordPress site. So then you log into the admin, you install a theme, and you author posts in a WYSIWYG editor. And then when you load the site and hit that page, it queries a MySQL database, pulls the contents of the post out of the database and shows it to you, right? And that's kind of the alternative way that people approach this. Now, if you think about it, like displaying a blog post doesn't have to happen. That computation doesn't need to happen in real time. Like a blog post is static inherently, right? It's just text. So what static site generators do is basically leverage the fact that very much of what lives on a website doesn't need to change from visitor to visitor, right? And so all of this can effectively be pre-compiled. So caching is not even necessary because it's just static right from the origin server, right? And there's a bunch of other benefits to using this. I mean, security is another huge one. So I heard the statistic recently that like on average it takes 11 days for a WordPress install to become compromised if you don't update it.
Another very disturbing WordPress statistic is that the seventh most visited site, or the seventh most visited URL on my site, is alchemist.camp/wp-admin.
Admin. Yep.
Which doesn't exist. It's just they're nasty people hoping it exists.
Yeah, I mean I heard one of the co-founders of Netlify talk about how which is a static site hosting platform, talk about how they receive hundreds of millions of requests from bots just sniffing for WP-admin route. And so yeah, it's a very it's kind of like it's as ubiquitous as Windows is on desktop operating systems, and so it's no surprise that that if it's hackable, that people will be trying to hack it, right? So
static sites are growing pretty quickly in popularity. They're easy to host. Yep. It's very cheap to host them because you're not doing you've done all that compilation up front instead of hitting a database and doing work every single time a request comes in. Traditionally, some people have struggled with comments and use things like Discus plugins, which I'm actually using on my non-static sites just for convenience.
Yep.
But with StaticKit, you're going to make it easier for people to do a lot more than that.
Yeah. So the idea is, I think static sites are growing in popularity in the sense of like there's an increasing number of developers who are excited about using them. There's kind of a trend of more and more developers are starting out as front end devs. Like they go through these kind of boot camps or these, become a developer in 9-month type programs. And very likely they're learning JavaScript as one of their first languages, right? They're learning React, they're learning HTML, CSS. And so there's this world has a lot of front end developers. And there's so much energy going into the tooling ecosystem around JavaScript and around, just kind of front end environments. The trend now is to push more and more of the work into the front end. Chris Coyer gave this great talk at JamstackConf, and I think he's been giving it in a lot of different places on kind of the developer speaking circuit, talking about basically how I guess front end, we're all front end developers now or something like that. And the point being like things that used to be traditionally squarely in the purview of the back end server side developer, is gradually being pushed more and more to the front end. So what this means is like backends are getting more boring, and a lot of the interesting stuff is happening on the front end. And this aligns really well with kind of the modern take on static site generators, things like Next.js and Gatsby, where you can do so much writing React code that is capable of being server side rendered, basically, and you can convert that into HTML on the server side, so you get all the benefits of a fast page load coming straight down from the server. But then as you navigate through the site, things can you can swap out the DOM in real time by executing the React code on the front end, and everything is just it's kind of the best of both worlds, right? So all of that is true, but still, if you want to do things like accept form submissions or process payments in a more complicated way than a Stripe checkout button will do, or put some kind of auth or identity on your site, or search, like all of those things, you may be able, if you were running WordPress, you could just install a WordPress plugin to do it.
Yeah.
But if you're using a static site generator, I mean, it's just a core limitation of the technology that like there is no server for you to execute stuff on unless you write your own kind of serverless Lambda functions or something, or spin up an Elixir backend or do something like that. And so the idea behind StaticKit is to provide slices of backend functionality to fill in those gaps and make it basically feasible to build whatever kind of website you want to build using static technologies, and filling in kind of the server side gaps using StaticKit.
So one thing I think a lot of bootstrappers would be interested in, although I'm sure you probably have your own data now, is integrating with email providers like Drip or ConvertKit, tools like WriteMessage. Basically, like once you've got a certain amount of traffic, it's really nice to know what person is looking at a page and which pages have they looked at, and of the people who have gone through XYZ page, what percentage have made a purchase. And there's just a lot you can do once you can start hooking all of that together.
Sure.
Are you integrating with like any of those like external marketing tools, or making plugins or anything like that yet?
Yeah. So I mean, I'm starting to build out the kind of integration side of it right now, actually. So the first integration I'm building is a MailChimp integration, because that's one of the most popular email providers on the market. And it's pretty interesting, actually, the way that people are kind of wanting to use StaticKit. So I deliberately went with the approach of having the software configured via a config file. So similar to configuring your CI platform, for example, where you drop a config file in your repository. It's version controlled right alongside your code, but it basically allows you to declare what the state of the world should be on StaticKit. So you can say, I want these different forms with these names, and I want them to perform these actions upon submission, for example. And so I'm building out, starting with the MailChimp integration, the ability to obviously take a form submission and convert that into a subscriber in their MailChimp account. Also, you hook into their event tracking system. So if you want, so you can say, like, as soon as someone submits this form, maybe this is a specific lead magnet that signifies that you want to kick off some workflow in MailChimp, for example, then you can just declare, like, when this specific form is submitted, I want to track this particular event and start a workflow in MailChimp. And, all of that, like, maybe you would normally have to use something like Zapier to make that happen.
I was going to say, like, back when I last was running a static site, I think that kind of stuff would have been really hard without Zapier.
Yeah, and I think Zapier is a fantastic tool, and it's like gives people an idea of kind of the power of getting tools talking to each other, and demonstrates like how much you can get done with that. But I think in like having customer conversations, there's kind of it's kind of a blocker for a lot of people, I think, to imagine like key parts of their site infrastructure relying on this like this Zapier UI where anyone can log in and like go and mess with zaps, and you get to a certain point where like you have 10 different zaps running, and it's kind of hard to understand what's actually going on, and things start to feel brittle, because I think it's just targeted towards an audience of people who are not necessarily technical, so it has to be kind of palatable for a wide range of use cases, right?
And are you focused more on the developer end of that market, or
Definitely.
okay?
Yep.
Because that
Yep.
was, I started off on WordPress, and WordPress was great when I was like a power user who wasn't a programmer.
Yep.
But looking back on it now, like I realized a lot of things that I thought were great were actually way more
Yeah.
convoluted than what you would write from scratch as a
Yeah.
developer.
Yeah, and I think that I think the tooling ecosystem, even around kind of static sites, is improving for that type of user as well. Like I think of tools like Webflow, which is kind of like Squarespace, but gives like generates a website for you, so you're not like reliant on their platform. It's not a walled garden in that sense. And so I think like things are improving, yeah, for non-technical folks or less technical folks, all the way down to the people who are a trained front end developer and know their way around React and are comfortable with editing a JSON config file, but don't want to spend the time spinning up a back end and writing all this back end code. They just want to stick to the front end.
This is exciting stuff. Definitely want to follow your journey with that. We're coming up on half an hour, so I just want to
Cool.
ask you a couple last questions.
Sure.
You recommended a bunch of books on your page,
Mm-hmm.
of which I've read most of, actually. Is there anything recently you've been reading that you haven't put up there yet?
Ooh.
Or I could just go the two that I haven't read. Obviously Awesome and
Yeah.
The Challenger Sale. Which one do you think is more useful for somebody building like a super early stage thing where you've got, some visitors, but
Yeah.
you're still not selling anything?
Yeah. I think obviously Awesome is really great. Like it's not a dense read. It's a very actionable read, and I think so it's about positioning basically, and
Mm-hmm.
how to think about talking about your product to other people basically, and in your marketing copy, and how you describe what you're building. And I think it's a really good framework, and it kind of I think it's best if you have kind of an existing thing running and you have some users already, and you can kind of work off of that data. But I think it's still helpful ways to think about positioning even early on, and it's not too theoretical. So I think that one is it's highly recommended. The Challenger Sale, friend of mine is a professional salesperson, and he recommended that one to me when I was thinking about, like, I've never done a product that requires having a sales team. Drip eventually did have a sales team in its later years, but it's, even if you don't have like a full sales team, I think it's helpful to think about this as like putting yourself in the mind of an effective salesperson, and I think it does help in crafting marketing copy and all that other stuff. So yeah.
Cool. Well, I will dig into that and put obviously Awesome on my list. Yeah. So thanks again for coming on, and I
Totally.
will obviously link up your podcast that I
Yeah.
mentioned a zillion times. And StaticKit is there a good place for people to follow you online?
Yeah, so I'm Derrick Reimer on Twitter, and derrickreimer.com is my website. Have a newsletter there. And yeah, Art of Product podcast. Ben and I do a weekly show talking about what we're up to. So you can follow
Highly
me there too.
recommended. All right. Thanks, Derek.
Cool. Thanks for having me, Mark.